Phil Phails at Philosophy.
It starts off with kind of like the importance or how to develop knowledge. Higher knowledge is what it calls it. Knowledge of that it goes through three phases for Buddhist thinkers to develop knowledge. One is to study a topic, and then to contemplate about a topic, and then to meditate on a topic. And as you do one, as you progress through these three, you develop a higher level of knowledge, or what they called higher knowledge, discernment or insight was achieved by going through all of these, which makes sense. Although more assimilation of meaning as one goes further is what it said. I wonder, like, when I don't know what they mean by meditate.
I think they mean meditate.
Right. I get studying. Like, I'm studying philosophy with you.
Right. And that's clearly what they're talking about there is there's a way you gain knowledge by reading, studying, listening to teachers.
Right, that's studying.
Right.
Contemplation is like, I'm thinking about this when I'm not looking, when I'm not. And what that means for me is like, as I'm moving through the world and talking to people, I'm thinking about the discussions I'm having and the world that I'm living in through the context of what I've studied.
Right. And I think we talked about this last time, that deductive reasoning is a form of contemplation, right?
Right.
And it's part of why it's such a productive form for us is because I think it's an actually relatively natural form, right? We engage in deductive reasoning all the time. When we study logic, we're not learning to do something we don't already do. We're learning to do it with a greater level of precision, with a greater level of attention to the form, because we make mistakes when we just do it without doing that, right? And so we're really trying to eliminate those kinds of mistakes. There's cognitive biases, there's formal fallacies that we can fall into, where our natural tendencies to use deductive reasoning don't always work right. And some of that just has to do with the fact that it's a slow process. Most of our knowledge is social, which is, I think, when we talk about study, we're actually talking about a form of social knowledge. It's knowledge we derive from our community, through books, through conversations.
What have people read about something? What have people discovered? How do I take myself to the edge of what's known by finding out what people have said and done?
But then, and this is where I think you see a difference between Buddhism and Western thought, right? There's this notion of meditation that there's a kind of awareness, a kind of a knowledge that we can attain in particular types of meditative states that require a certain kind of technical skill to get to. That's why the discussion of technical knowledge at the end is interesting. Because when we talk about technical knowledge in the Western tradition, it's often, it's the knowledge of the ability to do something, right?
Yeah.
Which is different than how we represent that. We could, like if you're saying, how do you make an apple pie? You can put out a series of claims, right? And look at how they relate to each other.
Right.
A series of steps, you can represent it in language like that.
Right.
But that's different than the knowledge that you have that allows you to go make a pie.
Right.
Right?
That's like knowledge of versus knowledge of skill.
Right, yeah.
Which we'll talk about later.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that meditation within Buddhism seems to be a kind of skill.
Yeah. Well,
that gets you to a certain type of awareness that's more like perceptual knowledge.
Don't you hone the ability to like realize a certain frequency in the brain, whether it's like delta? I've got this binaural beats where you can play them, and they've got different states. And I've heard that when skilled meditators meditate, they reach this level or this type of frequency range in their brain, whether it's theta or delta. I don't remember the exact one. But so they're actually tuning their brain differently. We know from the person whose work I know most is Andy Newberg, who has studied. He's one of the first people who started hooking up brain imaging. Yeah. Did he take the Buddhists and he brought them over to America and then
he had Tibetan Buddhist meditators. Right. He had nuns who were praying, like all sorts of contemplative states, and identified certain types of brain states.
Unique.
Right? Activation of the frontal lobe, that are associated with certain and part of what's interesting, I remember from when I was reading his stuff, is that he identified at least two different kinds of contemplative states in terms of the neurological patterns we see. One associated with the quieting of the mind, and one associated with like visionary types of contemplation. And there are different kinds of neurological states, but there are also types of neurological states we don't see associated with other activities. So yeah, something's going on. Now, whether that means we're tuning into some sort of frequency or not, that's a speculative step.
Yeah.
I think we should be hesitant to jump there too quickly. We know it's associated with that there are certain types of brain states associated with certain types of contemplative states. And from the Buddhist perspective, I think that's what they're talking about with meditation. They're talking about these kinds of modes of awareness that come from certain types of mental practices.
One last thing on this level of knowledge thing that struck me was this idea of contemplation being something that I need to actively do. And I maybe questioned that for a bit, because I was actively engaged in the study. I was excited about it. And so it just penetrated my life in a lot of ways that made contemplation effortless. It was just like, I'm excited to follow down this path. And I don't know that I actively contemplated, that I sat down and said, I'm going to contemplate time. It was more like it flowed out of an engaged, it spilled over from engaged study, passionate study.
No, it's a good question. What do we mean by contemplation? And does, like, if I'm out in the garden, and I just read this chapter, all right, I'm weeding stuff, I'm engaging in all this labor, and then my brain just kicks in and is like starting to think about that. Is that contemplation? Yes. Or does it require some sort of like intentionality to contemplate and some level of discipline about how I think through that? I think both. I think we're better served by both. I think naturally, both are and both are contemplation, right? The second type of thing, which is I think maybe what they're trying to get to when they say you need to actively engage in it, is more about making sure that when you're contemplating, you're doing it well, right? Like that you're making sure you're pulling it off for what you want to accomplish. In the same way, anything else, right? If I am distracted while I'm doing one thing by another thing, I'm not going to do that one thing as well. So if I can bring focus to the act of contemplation and take care with how I make the steps in that contemplation through some sort of formal system, right? Then I can be more assured, given that there's evidence that formal system produces better thoughts.
You'll get there.
That I'll get there, right?
What came to mind was there's this saying that I think we've had in America, or at least in my lifetime, of practice makes perfect.
Right.
And what I've started hearing later in my life, and what I think applies here, is that practice makes permanent.
Right.
And that came to mind when you said, are you contemplating well?
Right.
Because how you contemplate is going to dictate the results you have and the outcomes, or the where you land with regard to what you're this level 2.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, it's not as directly related because, it's partly the study side, but I think in terms of like the plurality of crazy ideas we encounter in the world, right? Right now, especially in the internet age, of people who have done research, right?
Right.
And, as someone who's a trained researcher, I often look at what they're doing. I'm like, that's not research, but they've habituated to an idea that research is just going and gathering stuff that seems to look good and fits together in a cool way, right?
In a compelling way that people that gets views. Right.
And I think that's part of what's driving it, is that attention getting is driving the
A certain
research,
type of research.
a certain type of research.
Where they're probably
Right.
Prioritizing provocative content
Right.
in their research. Maybe.
Right. And so I think, yeah, you can do things and do things well or do things poorly. And you're still doing that thing. You're just doing a bad job.
Yeah.
Right.
And your outcome will be impacted
Right. Absolutely.
by how you do it.
Absolutely.